Good day everyone and welcome to my guide for the new Greymoor patch. As per usual, this will consist out of a general section in which I will talk a little bit about the changes that they have made to the gameplay in this patch, and after that I will present to you the builds that I have, which I have found to be the best in the testing that I have done so far. All those builds will also be available in links in the description, as well as in the Discord server, of which you can also find the link in the description. I will also clearly mark the differences between the gameplay that all of those builds represent, as well as just the benefits and drawbacks. Any questions you have, you can also ask in the comment section here or on the Discord server. This guide is going to work well with the two previous gameplay guides I have made before. One for the basic gameplay mechanics for MagSorc and one for a little bit more advanced gameplay mechanics. Links for that you can also find in the description of this video. But just to be clear, this video will be purely about builds and just how to put it, theoretical changes basically for this patch, and the information about burst combos, defensive skill rotations, etc. you can find in those two other videos, again linked in the description of this patch. There will also be some gameplay with those builds that I will release in the coming weeks with recordings that I have already made and recordings that are yet to come. But that being said, I will now start with the general changes that they have done to MagSorc in this patch. Now, one of the main hallmarks of this patch, of course, is the Vampire rework. I'm going to keep it really simple here. Basically, Vampire has nothing to offer for MagSorc, so you just want to go and drop it. Then the next thing is the race choice. As per usual, this is mostly between High Elf and Briton. Like before, High Elf is still ever so slightly better than Briton. However, if you are a Briton, I do not recommend using your money to buy a race change here, because the difference is too small to even really notice. Another thing that they've done is the healing reduction in PvP, basically a 20% nerf to healing. Now, this is kind of an indirect shield buff, as now in comparison shields are stronger than heals than they were before. Which is quite nice for MagSorc especially, of course. And then the last thing I want to mention is not really a change, but something that has been found as of recently, which is an add-on. An add-on that is named Only Cast Crystal Fragments proc, and you know, if you're into MagSorc and you still cast hard-casted fragments, or you have problems with the bug that sometimes causes you to cast a hard-casted fragment, this add-on is definitely worth a try. Though I do have to mention that it does not function as well in lag in my experience. Still worth a try. Now, for the builds, as I mentioned before, all links can be found on my server. I will just go over some of the general stuff first, and then comparisons between the builds, outlining the benefits and the drawbacks. Any detailed information about enchants, on the weapons, on the gear, and more, you can always find that in the links. Now, for starters, I have noticed that this patch has truly brought an explosion in the amount of possibilities you have to make a build for MagSorc. Whereas before I could cover everything in a single guide, now I really have to choose between what I find to be the absolute best, also based on my own preference. I will give reasons for that, etc., of course, but I can't really cover everything anymore in this guide, because there are so many sets and playstyles you can use right now, consisting out of Necropotence, Alfiq, Praetor's Boast, Armorplasm, Seducer, Shacklebreaker, Warlock, all the antiquities and all the monster sets, and then the Master Staff and a whole bunch more. There's all different builds one can make with that. There's a lot to test, which I have basically already finished now. I know what I like in this patch. But I do want to give along that there has never been a better opportunity really in a long time to do theory crafting yourself as well, because there are so many possibilities that will work out. There's a lot to you know, throw your brain against basically and get creative with. So I really do advise to also do a little bit of theory crafting yourself. I'm not saying that you shouldn't listen to this guide at all, but I am saying that theory crafting is a really fun part in the game, and it's definitely worth a try, especially this patch, because there is so many possibilities. However, some things are mostly the same in the Magic Sorcerer builds you will find going around, and one of them is the Mundus Stone, which is in most cases still going to be the Mage Mundus. That is basically because pushing Maximum Magicka is still the best option, because it gives you both defense and with the shields and damage. Concerning enchantments, you can always find those in the links, but one thing I do want to mention is that on the High Elves you will usually go for more damage enchantments, more regeneration enchantments I mean, while on the Breton you will go for more damage enchantments in combination with maybe a stamina regeneration glyph, because High Elf has that stamina passive, while the Breton does not have that. Now, if for some reason on the Breton you end up with a magic regeneration glyph and a stamina regeneration glyph on your jewelry, I do advise going with 2 of those tri-stat regeneration glyph instead. I think they are called Indico, like prismatic regeneration. Here we go. That's basically going to give you the same amount of Magicka sustain and stamina sustain, but it's going to give you a little bit of health recovery on top. It's not worth that much for Sorcerer, but for min-maxing, this is something worth considering. For potions, most of my builds are still going to be using the spell power potions. If you see in some builds that I have Surge or whatever, which you won't, spoiler, then I use tripods. But in any case, tripods are still something I switch to at times when I'm under heavy pressure from a group or whatever, and just really need the stamina sustain there, and I'm not planning to do any like offensive abilities. I'm planning to just sustain, kite it out, etc. Then I do still switch to tripods. But as I said, basic potion is still the spell power potion. For the poisons, I still have on the back bar here on the restoration staffs. On every time that I use a restoration staff, I put an escapist poison on it, because the control this gives over the enemy is something that you don't really have much as a sorcerer. You don't really work with roots. This thing does it, adds it into the build. Plus it gives you unstoppable, which is actually the strongest factor to be considered here. It just allows you to continue to your burst combos, etc. without being CC'd. It's really nice, especially because it's going to proc mostly when you are on the defensive, on the restoration bar. And on the side note, on the offensive bar, I still go with infused shock glyphs, simply for that little bit of extra pinch of damage that the shock glyphs will add, and also the chance to proc minor vulnerability, which is going to increase your damage by 8% against that target. For the armor weights, there's been a little bit of a change here as well. In general, it's still best to strive towards a 5 light armor, 1 medium, 1 heavy. But sometimes you will end up with 6 light and 1 heavy because of the new antiquities, which are rings. If you run with 2 light armor sets, then you have not really a choice. You have to go with 6 and 1. And when you do that, I do advise going with heavy, because for a 1 piece of this armor weight, this is going to give you the biggest benefit. For the CP allocations for all of these builds, you can also find them in the links. However, I'm not going to do much of an explanation here, only when it comes to the Malakath antiquity, because I've already gone over this quite a few times. You can just copy paste what you find and you will have a good CP allocation. As for one of the most surprising changes I have seen this patch, as I mentioned before, you can now run heavy armor on Magic Sorcerer. This is due to Malakath making up for the damage loss that you had before from running heavy armor, because you're losing out on the crit passive from light armor. But now with Malakath's ring here on top of heavy armor, you can have a really good amount of damage while having that resistance and sustain from heavy armor, which is something that I have utilized in my builds, and I have utilized it in gameplay as well. I'm quite satisfied with how it plays out as well, but more about that later when I get to the build. For traits, they have also changed some things with critical resistance. First of all, they've added the base amount of critical resistance of 1350, and they have nerfed the impenetrable trait. This means that it will now be more beneficial to run a few other traits instead of impenetrable. You can see in the Excel file I have linked in the description some of the maths concerning that, and also the Malakath's band here. More about that later. But Like end of the line for me, I prefer to go with 5 well fitted and 2 impenetrable. I'm still keeping some to have some defense against like Stamblade gankers, etc. But the well fitted is really beneficial for just short sprints in towers, but especially because of the roll dodge you can do, it greatly increases the amount of mobility I have in combat, as well as the damage reduction that this gives. Now, as I was talking about Malakas anyway, the antiquities that have been added this patch, there's 2 of them that are interesting from MagSorc, which is the Malakas Band and the Torque of Tonal Constancy. Now, first about this tonal torque here, I am mostly going to be using this in builds in no CP. There is also a CP build with it, but the sustain from this set is mainly beneficial in no CP. Why is this? Because in CP I'm already quite fine on sustain. I don't need that much extra stamina recovery. Same goes with the magic sustain, it's quite easy to get. You have much more benefit of running the Malakas ring in CP. Because in CP then damage is more of an issue, something that I want to get into my builds. While in no CP damage is already fine, so I would rather get some regeneration, which is a problem in no CP. As for the Malakas band here, this does also mean you will have a little bit of a different champion point setup. You can't deal critical damage anymore, so it's not much use to go with the points into Elfborn anymore. When I do that, I have simply taken the points out of Elfborn, and I've put them in mostly in Elemental Expert, Spell Erosion, and Master at Arms, together with some into Staff Expert here. For a last thing I want to mention for the general section in this patch is that there is now also a choice to make in builds for the offensive combo. More specifically, whether you want to use Streak as CC or Destructive Clench. Destructive Clench, which you are going to use with the Masters, the Perfected Master Staff preferably, is going to have a lot more bursts. If you want to have a high damage burst, I think it is best to go with Clench over here, because of the extra spell damage it gives. You're going to have way more damage than you will have with CC as a stun. However, the range on this thing is much more than all your other abilities, so that I think is a strong drawback to it, especially when you're going to use this as a spammable. So with Clench as a spammable and Fury on top of that to have extra burst. This is something you can only run where you get rather close, which means you can't really use one of the sorcerer's strongest points, which is its ability to kill people at long distance. Now, more about the spammable with Fury. This is best on builds that already have a lot of damage as well, so either with like offensive sets like Molakina or with things like the Malakas Band, etc. Because otherwise your burst is not going to bring people down to the 20% health mark at which Endless Fury is going to explode. The other way of running Destructive Clench is using it purely as a CC and a bit of a buff to the rest of your combo, while you are using a different spammable. I am mostly fan of this. I've had the best effect with this, to be honest. Mostly I use Elemental Weapons spammable here, and then Reach on my 5th slot, Reach Clench on my 5th slot as a CC. This is also better for builds that are more like all-rounded, so with a good amount of sustain, damage resistance, etc., which is mostly what I go for. About the other stun, Streak, for starters, this is a much better stun than Destructive Clench. It has more range because it's also going to stun people in front of it. It's unblockable, it's undodgeable, and it's AoE. Especially that AoE part here is going to give you a huge amount of control if you are fighting in group, which is something that I find very hard to give up. Next to that, it also leaves you with an extra skill slot to lose, because you don't have to slot Destructive Clench anywhere. And on this skill slot I can then slot Elemental Drain, which is going to give me the extra magic sustain, but it's also going to recuperate some of that damage I lose by not running Destructive Clench into my build. Meaning that with this I can still have a good amount of burst and a good amount of damage. That's for the general changes they have done in this match. I'm going to go into the builds now. There are varieties for each kind of playstyle I have made that I find to be the best. I have done this for both CP and no CP, and for pet builds and for non-pet builds. Starting off with the CP non-pet builds, those have the largest variety into them. There's 4 builds, each have their benefits and drawbacks. You can make your choice based on what I have mentioned before and on what I will mention now, which build you think will be the best for you, but you can also just roll a dice and pick either of them. I guarantee you're going to have a good build. The first build in this list is the classic Alfiq and Brightrust Burst, which has also been used in previous patches a lot. This is still a decent setup. You can use this either with a monster set or with an antiquity. So the options you have here are Molakina for more overall damage, more of the Infernal for more a single target pressure thing. This is not to be underestimated in terms of damage, by the way, more of the Infernal. And then lastly, you also have Pirate Skeleton if you want to have more resistances. However, you also get the Mage and Defile though. However, there is more to this set than meets the eye at first. Then you have the Antiquities, which is Tonal and Malakath. As for CP, as I have mentioned before, I prefer to use Malakath in my builds, so if you're going with this build, I would also advise that. It uses Streak as a stun, and if you're looking for a first easy to get build from Magic Sorcerer, I advise also going for this because you can just buy Alfiq and Throat. You will have some of the options for Shoulder and Helm, and then you are ready to go. The second build is going to make use of that little bit I have said about heavy armor. This is going to be 5 heavy Seducer and 5 Crafty Alfiq with 1 Domi House, again for the 1-piece bonus here. It's actually better to run the heavy armor Domi House here, not the medium armor, as I mentioned before. This build is, as I mentioned, with heavy armor, going to be very resistant to damage. You're still going to have a lot of damage because you have Malakath, and if you look at the stats, you still see you have almost 48k Magicka and 1.9k spell damage. The regeneration, which might seem low at first, is actually quite decent because you are running Seducer, 10% cost reduction, and you are having heavy armor, which has a sustain bonus in it as well. Another benefit that this build has next to the resistance is the fact that you can have an extra skill slot here, because this build does not need 2 shields. It has enough with simply using Hardened Ward and Rapid Regeneration here. The Dampened Magic slot then becomes open to use other slots in. One option here is slotting Degeneration. It's going to give you the Major Sorcery. That means you can switch away from Spell Power Potions. Spell Power Potions, which are on Malakath builds not even going to have as much of a benefit, because that little spell crit bonus that it gives is not going to be useful, as you can't crit damage abilities. It still has something for critting Rapid Regeneration, but not as much as without Malakath. This way you can use Tripods, which is going to greatly buff your stamina sustain, and of course the extra heal is always useful as well. Me, however, I still keep on using the spell proportions in this particular build, and I switched Mines as on this bar here on the skill slot. It's mainly a bias for myself as well, because I absolutely love using Mines in PvP. You will see some gameplay with it as well. It's great for stacking people, for controlling. You can even like put it all in a little corridor and it will all stack and deal a lot of damage at once. It's really good against melee people. It does cost quite a bit of Magicka, so you gotta watch out for that, but I definitely love using this skill, which is why you will also see me using this build every now and then, because this is a build that can reliably use Mines without giving up too much on other skills, etc. The next build is one with the Destructive Clench with the Master Staff, which is Crafty Alfiq, Lich on the back bar, Master Staff on the front bar, and again Malakath with 1 Domi House. This is going to be again a 6 and 1 setup, so 6 light armor and 1 heavy armor. Lich here on the back bar is commonly still still the best back bar set here. There's also Warlock and Armor Master, but Lich comes out on top when it comes to back bar sets. You can see here in this particular setup I have Reach as a spammable, as and Fury as an execute, but this does not have to be like that. After all, I still prefer putting Reach as a stun purely, and then using a spammable like Elemental Weapon or Crushing Shock. As for Elemental Weapon versus Crushing Shock, I'm quickly going to mention this as well. Basically, I prefer using Elemental Weapon, but Crushing Shock has its own benefits and drawbacks as well. I advise you to use both and see for yourself which one you like the most. Now, on this build, as you already have Clench as a CC, you don't need to have Streak on the front bar anymore. You can put that on the back bar and use Ball of Lightning as well, which is going to greatly improve the amount of kiting you can do. Overall, this build here is your go-to build if you are preferring the Master Staff, based on the comparisons I've made earlier. There is, however, also a second build which you might like a lot. I certainly do, which is Alfiq, Willpower, a monster set, the Master Staff, and then again Malakath as a antiquity here. This build is the only one I have that uses both a monster set and an antiquity, so if you're looking into that, this is the way to go. This is the best option basically to incorporate that into your build. You also have the Perfected Inferno Staff on top with the extra burst with Malakath, and if you go out, for example, Keeney as a monster set, this is really going to count. Another difference with this build here is the Backbar Staff. You have two options here basically. Either you go with the Perfected Black Rose Restoration Staff and you switch to Healing Ward, or you go with the Restoration Staff of the Potentates, which is going to reduce your damage taken. I prefer the Perfected Restoration Staff here with Healing Ward, because Healing Ward with this is actually not a bad heal at all. I was quite surprised by this, but it is still decent in terms of healing. The reason you don't see me using this skill over Rapid Regeneration in most cases though is because it's basically a killable heal. If you are under heavy pressure and your shields are going down in second after second after second, your Healing Ward is not going to heal you much at all. However, with the Black Rose Prison Resto on top, if you can manage to even get one tick of the Healing Ward, it's going to count for quite a bit, and the shield is quite big. On top of that, you get the Magic Regeneration on the back bar, which is very useful. Because of the drawback that this build has, which is that it is quite low on Magic Sustain. As you can see on the front bar, it's only 1436 unbuffed in light armor, so you don't get like anything like Seducer or Heavy Armor passes on top of that. So you gotta keep that into account with this build. To the point that sometimes on this build I have also dropped Malakath away, and that is then the build that I will be using Torque of Tonal Constancy for, simply for the extra sustain that it gives. 1400 and something is often not enough for me at all to sustain. However, if you are looking for a build that just boosts out the maximum you can get into damage, this is really the go-to, as I mentioned, with Master Staff, Malakath, and Molakina or Maw of the Infernal. Now for the no CP builds, I have one for that here, which is one I've mentioned before actually, is Alfiq, Throat, and one Antiquity and one Dummy. As you probably have guessed, for this Antiquity, this is going to be the Torque of Tonal Constancy, and then with one Dummy House and the Hat of Necropotence, of Praetor's Boast. The reason I choose this build for no CP, well, there's a bunch of reasons actually. First of all, it's still very solid on stats. If you use the Spring-Loaded Diffusion, which by the way I forgot in the first time I presented Alfiq and Throat, you get a really high amount of maximum magicka still, with also a good amount of regeneration, spell damage, etc. I use Tonal, as mentioned before, for the regeneration that I lack, and this build is also going to be using Streak as a stun. I find that better in no CP than using Destructive Clench, for two reasons. The first reason is because Streak is going to be much more impactful on the enemy's stamina sustain. This can often be a problem in no CP, stamina sustain, and if somebody is blocking for some time or roll dodging all my attacks and then I streak through them, after which they have to break free on top of that, this is going to be a really big hit on their stamina sustain, which is quite beneficial. Also, the damage is already fine, so I don't really mind using Streak here either. It's still quite nice damage, by the way. The second reason I like to use Streak here is because it allows me to basically defend myself better in an in-combat situation. When I'm fighting a group of people, if I can stun them all at once every now and then with an AoE CC, this is going to allow me to get some resources back with Dark Conversion, or to like break their damage on me, so I don't have to keep shield stacking, which is quite beneficial for my sustain indirectly. So yeah, that's the reasons I prefer this build in particular for no CP. Now for the pet builds in general, they are going to be tankier than the non-pet builds. But the problem is that you are relying on a killable heal basically. You're going to have to learn to deal with when that pet dies. It is most beneficial to run Ball of Lightning for this, because then you can cast one Ball of Lightning and then cast your pet again after that. You can't get interrupted by Crushing Shock or any other magic abilities that can stun or interrupt you, which is very useful to counter people killing your pet. Otherwise, also LOS, etc. to recast that pet. It's the most important thing for pet builds. I can't stress it enough. You need to be able to deal with that. Generally, also, this is not as flexible as the non-CP, as the non-pet builds, because you have that extra skill slot that you will always have to slot for the pet, which means that you don't really have that many other options in terms of building. Now, for the CP and the no CP build, I have actually the same build for pet, which is going to be Necropotence Lich with the Master Staff and then an Antiquity. That is right here. With the Sword and Board and Back Bar, of course, you don't need Resto Staff anymore, so I will gladly take the extra tankiness that this is going to give. As a enchant, I use the Magical Return enchant. Sometimes you want to do a heavy attack with the one-handed here. It's quite nice for stamina sustain as well, especially in no CP. With the pet up, you will have a decent amount of stats as you had before with this particular build. The reason I prefer this build with Reach and the Master Staff is because it fits the pet gameplay much better. It is more of a tanky playstyle, more melee, so to speak. You stand closer towards your enemy, and in that case you don't really feel the drawback of the short range of clench anymore, which is why I really like that. The extra damage is also very useful. Edge Knock is also part of this approach, which is why I prefer it over Overload here. Also just the more hold your ground kind of playstyle that Pet Sorcs are much better in. For no CP, the reason I use the same build, well, almost the same build, the only thing I changed, as I mentioned before, is the Malakath band into Torque of Tonal Constancy. The reason I still use the same thing is because there too, pet builds are better working in close range. They don't kite as much as they fight, so that means I can make use of Reach much more. It's a bigger benefit than using Streak basically for pressuring their stamina more. Next to that, also having Ball of Lightning on the back bar is beneficial for recasting the pet, dark conversions, etc. If you screw one of those up, if you get interrupted once like that in no CP, it's a it's a mistake obviously, but it's going to cost you much more than the CP as well, which is why I prefer having that extra safeguard against it. A last thing I also want to mention in terms of battlegrounds, these are also no CP, so it fits right here. I also prefer running this build, but now this is the one case where I prefer to run Fury for the extra burst and then Reach as a spam bull. For Battlegrounds, I also prefer to run Malakath again instead of Tonal Architect, Torque of Tonal Constancy, because there the regeneration is not as much of an issue for you, because you don't have to take all the damage alone. You can always go behind your group a little bit, do a heavy attack, dark conversion, whatever, use synergies. Your sustain is going to be better in Battlegrounds than it is in open world no CP, which is why I go with Malakath again. The damage from Malakath allows me to have higher burst, allows me to use Reach as a spam bull, because I'm gonna get there, I'm gonna get people to 20%, especially when with the group mates on top of that. And the best thing is that this allows me to run Fury then, which is pretty much an essential skill for Magic Sorcerer and Battlegrounds, because that is the kill stealing skill. That's the main point of running Magic Sorcerer. On top of that, I am a pet build in here, which is also nice because I can heal my group mates while I'm healing myself as well. One thing I forgot to mention about pet builds earlier is that I also run one shield here, much like the heavy armor build I've mentioned in the beginning of the build section. You have enough defense in light armor pet build. This is also the reason I don't go with heavy armor pet builds. It's already tanky enough, so I'd rather go with something that gives me a little bit of extra damage, etc. So much for the builds. The only section that is left is the honorable mentions. As per usual, these are going to be skills, sets, etc. that I have considered for this patch, or that I see other people advise sometimes, that I don't find worth running. I am going to remove the pet though, because it annoys me. F. The first of that is the Amplasm set. Now, Amplasm set is a really good set. It got buffed this patch. You can make good builds for that, but I find that running the Torque of Tonal Constancy is better for pushing sustain, and then you can get sets with Maximum Magicka instead, which is working out better. It's also wasted, like Amplasm also has a wasted set bonus in builds that utilize Malakath, because it has a spell crit like buff on it, which is not going to do anything when you are running Malakath on top. The other set I want to mention is Engine Guardian. Engine Guardian has had a nerf on resources, however it does proc more now, and it resumes the beam when it gets interrupted, making it better for many builds out there for PvP. I do actually quite advise it on many other classes. I've seen like people making really good use of it. However, as it's quite ironic, because before it was really good on Magicka Sorcerer and quite bad on other classes, but now it's the other way around. The reason I'm saying that is because on Magicka Sorcerer, while you are streaking or kiting out, you are going to run out of the range of the Engine Guardian. Even just one streak is often going to be enough to break that beam, and this is really counterproductive for Magicka Sorcerer. Also, the fact that the resource return is nerfed is the reason that I have dropped this for the builds this patch. Then a skill, as I have kind of touched upon at the start, Critical Surge here. We have not seen it in any of my builds. One of the reasons is, again, Malakath's banned. It takes away your crits, so if you're not going to deal critical damage, you're not going to get healing from this, so this ability is next to useless. It's only going to be the major sorcery, in which case I prefer to use Regeneration, or definitely a Spell Power Potion. Another reason that I don't run this is something that has been lasting for longer, which is that I just don't like it if I don't have dots in my build. If you don't have dots, you don't have sustained pressure on the enemy, and that means you also don't have sustained healing from the surge that keeps on proccing from that dot. An example of that is while you are kiting around and you're not actively trying to kill somebody, if you happen to be on low health, then you don't really have much of an opportunity to go and like make bursts on somebody when people are chasing you. You just have to chase it out yourself. And if you're not damaging the enemy, or you don't have anything going on in terms of dots, you're not going to get any healing from this in a time where I need it the most. It leaves you weak at a time when I should get back up in health and resources. You can counter this a little bit by using Dark Conversion, however I do find this playstyle to be too risky to really try it. That being said, it is still not bad to run that instead of Rapid Regeneration. It's worth a try. Me personally, for these reasons, I just don't like it. Another set, an antiquity actually, that I have come across is the Snow Boots antiquity, which is going to remove all the snares and immobilizations on you, but you can't sprint. The reasons I don't run this is twofold. First of all, you get basically the same effect by running a build with a lot of well-fitted. Not only do you get the snare and immobilization immunity from roll dodges, but it's also going to reduce damage on top of that because everything misses. And that kind of overrides Snow Boots if you use both at the same time, which is something I really don't like to have in a build. The second reason is because of sprint. You can't sprint anymore, but sprinting is actually really good even for Magicka Sorcerer. If you are running up on a tower or around a rock or something, if you can't just immediately streak over it, it's very useful to do a little sprint with Boundless Storm, and you're going to be there much faster and for a cheaper cost than if you would be streaking around it twice. A final thing that I have to mention about this is that it also negates the effect of Ball of Lightning. It's also going to give you a bit of a snare and immobilization immunity. Snow Boots again is going to override this, which is why I don't really like using it for Magicka also. A last set I want to mention is something I have mentioned I think in every single guide I've ever made, which is Mighty Tudun. I keep on seeing this set being used. Also now, because there's a bit of stress, like what monster set are we going to run, now that Bloodborne is gone, etc. From this guide, you should have gathered that there's plenty of options that you can still use, and Tuden remains something suboptimal in my opinion. I'm not saying it's bad, like you can do something decent with it, but there is many other options that are going to perform better than it. There is in this guide plenty of builds as well where you can already use a wide variety of skills. We have the heavy armor build in which you can use regeneration or mines and other free flex spot. You always have the flex spot where elemental drain or fury is at, with reach as well. When you drop a shield for the pit builds as well. I don't really see much benefit in using Tuden anymore, just to create yet another skill slot. And next to that, you switch out Boundless Storm, but Boundless Storm is not a bad skill. As I've mentioned before with that little bit of sprinting, that's what you use Boundless Storm for, to have Major Expedition on top of that. It's very useful, as I said, in towers, and on top of that, it's also going to proc Surge healing. Should you choose to run Surge as healing instead of Rapid Regeneration, you're going to need Boundless Storm, because that is going to keep proccing AoE on the enemies, almost guaranteeing you that 3k health per second that Surge is going to give. Lastly, it is just better to have an actual monster set, because if you use Boundless Mighty Tuden, you basically are wasting a monster set bonus just to slot an extra skill, while there are, as I mentioned, good opportunities out there, so I really don't recommend doing that. Yeah, so that's it for the 3 monthly bashing on Mighty Tuden. That's it for the honorable mentions. Now, all I still have to tell you is something about the gameplay videos that will go on. As I mentioned at the start of this video, of this guide, there will be gameplay videos coming up later on. I already have guides up where I explain to you how to use these skills that I've been talking about. So both for offensive and defensive rotations, you can find them in the description below. Both for basic and more advanced mechanics. Next to that, again, the Discord is the ideal place to ask questions in. You can also find build links, etc. over there. Maybe one thing that you might have missed in this guide is a dueling build. I am thinking about that, but that's going to be for later this patch, because I'm starting with open world sorcery, etc. I am, however, looking into dueling, especially with the Bloodlord's Embrace Antiquity, that thing that gives you a crazy amount of magical sustain. But that will be for in the future. In any case, I thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this guide, that you've learned something from it. A last call I want to do to please try and tier craft yourself as well, because this is the perfect patch to do it. And yeah, thank you all very much for watching, and see you next time.